The Roman Republic was not a nation. It was a war machine. For centuries, its legions had advanced with the brutal certainty of a rising tide. To its enemies, the sight of them was a vision of grim mathematics. The sound was a symphony of dread, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals, the creak of leather, the jangle of steel, and above all, the chilling silence of disciplined men on the march. Its symbol was the legionary, a soldier of unmatched endurance, encased in armor, who fought as one part of a perfect, unstoppable system. By the middle of the 1st century BC, this system had conquered nearly the entire known world. From the shores of Spain to the plains of Anatolia, it was believed to be invincible. But on a baking plain in Mesopotamia in 53 BC, that belief was shattered. Here, the Roman war machine ground to a halt, not by a superior army, but by an enemy that refused to fight by Rome's rules. Here, the legions learned a horrifying lesson, that discipline is meaningless when you can't reach your enemy, and heavy armor becomes a mobile coffin under a relentless sun. This is the story of how the ambition of one man, the richest man in Rome, led 40,000 of the world's finest soldiers into a slaughter. It is the story of the Battle of Carrhae, a military disaster that would not only cost thousands of lives, but would also pour gasoline on the fires of civil war and help burn the Roman Republic to the ground. To understand the disaster at Carrhae, you must first understand the man who engineered it, Marcus Licinius Crassus. In an age of titans, Crassus stood as one of the 3 most powerful men in the world. He was a member of the First Triumvirate, an uneasy, unofficial political alliance that held the fate of Rome in its hands. His partners were living legends. Gnaeus Pompey, known as Pompey the Great, was the Republic's most celebrated general. He had crushed pirates in the Mediterranean and defeated the great king Mithridates in the east. Statues of him adorned the city. Then there was Gaius Julius Caesar, a political and military genius of terrifying ability. As Crassus planned his grand adventure, Caesar was in the midst of his breathtaking conquest of Gaul, subduing hundreds of tribes and adding a vast new territory to the Republic. His dispatches from the front lines being read to rapt audiences back in Rome. And then there was Crassus. Crassus didn't have Caesar's charisma or Pompey's beloved reputation. What he had was money, an almost unbelievable, obscene amount of it. He had built his fortune in the fires of Rome's first great civil wars. As Sulla proscribed his political enemies, Crassus was there, buying up their confiscated estates for a fraction of their worth. He created Rome's first fire brigade, but with a famous, ruthless twist. When a building caught fire, Crassus's agents would arrive and offer to buy the burning property and the buildings next to it for a ridiculously low price. If the terrified owner agreed, they would put out the fire. If not, they would simply stand by and let it burn. Through methods like this, he came to own a vast portion of the city of Rome itself. Ancient sources estimated his fortune at over 7,000 talents, a sum equal to the entire annual treasury of the Roman Republic, perhaps billions of dollars in modern terms. But in the fiercely competitive world of the Roman aristocracy, wealth was merely a tool. The ultimate currency was gloria, military glory, earned in the service of the state. And in this, Crassus lived in the immense shadows of his rivals. He did have one major military achievement to his name, a victory of which he was immensely proud. Years earlier, he had finally crushed the slave rebellion of Spartacus. He had brought the war to a decisive and brutal end, famously crucifying 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, a grim warning that stretched for miles into Rome. But even that victory had been tarnished. At the very end of the conflict, Pompey had returned from Spain, mopped up a few thousand fleeing slaves, and then brazenly wrote to the Senate, "Crassus has defeated the gladiators in a pitched battle, but I have torn up the war by its roots." The Senate, always favoring Pompey, awarded him a full triumph, while Crassus received a lesser honor. This slight festered in Crassus for nearly 20 years. Now, at over 60 years old, he was running out of time to cement a legacy that could rival the giants he stood beside. In 55 BC, the opportunity to finally seize that legacy arrived. As part of the triumvirate's political dealings, Crassus was granted the governorship of Syria for 5 years. For a Roman aristocracy, Syria was a golden ticket. It was a launch pad to the one great unconquered power on the world's horizon, the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were a formidable power, inheritors of the old Persian empires, ruling a vast territory stretching across modern-day Iran and Iraq. But to Crassus, they were just the final obstacle on his path to glory. He saw a swift, glorious campaign, a victory that would make him the conqueror of the East, a modern-day Alexander the Great. He used his personal fortune to raise an army of staggering size, 7 legions, totaling nearly 35,000 heavy infantry, along with 4,000 light infantry and 4,000 cavalry. His intentions were so nakedly aggressive that they caused a scandal in Rome. The Republic had a peace treaty with Parthia. There was no provocation, no casus belli, no cause for war beyond Crassus's own burning ambition. The opposition was fierce. One tribune of the plebes, Ateius Capito, seeing that he could not stop the expedition, resorted to a final desperate act. As Crassus and his army prepared to depart the city, Capito stood at the gates, lit a ceremonial brazier, and performed a terrifying public curse, calling upon the dark gods of the underworld to bring ruin on Crassus and his entire campaign. To the deeply superstitious Romans, this was a horrifying omen. Crassus, in his hubris, ignored it. As he told the Senate, the boundaries of his ambition were not the Tigris or Euphrates rivers, but the very edges of the world. The army Crassus led was the product of 500 years of battlefield evolution. At its heart was the legionary. He was a professional soldier, a citizen who had mastered the craft of war. His body was protected by a helmet, a chainmail shirt, and most importantly, the scutum, a large, curved, rectangular shield made of layers of wood glued together, covered in leather and reinforced with a metal boss. His primary weapons were the pilum and the gladius. The pilum was a heavy throwing spear, brilliantly engineered with a soft iron shank behind its hardened tip. When it struck an enemy's shield, it would bend, making it impossible to pull out or throw back, weighing the shield down and rendering it useless. The gladius was a short, broad sword, not for elegant fencing, but for brutal, close-quarters stabbing in the crush of a melee. But the real weapon was the legion itself. It was a system. On the battlefield, legions would advance in a checkerboard formation, a wall of shields and steel. They would unleash a volley of pili to shatter the enemy's charge and discipline, absorb the impact on their shields, and then, with cold fury, draw their gladii and systematically dismantle the enemy at arm's length. This system had been perfected in the forests of Gaul and the mountains of Spain. It relied on pinning an enemy and destroying them with relentless, disciplined, overwhelming force. The Parthians fought a different kind of war. Their military philosophy was born on the vast, open steppes of Central Asia. It was a philosophy of movement, distance, and shock. Their army consisted of two devastatingly effective and complementary cavalry units. First, the horse archer. These were thousands of lightly armored riders, men who had practically been born in the saddle. They were masters of the powerful composite bow. This was not a simple wooden stave. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, made of laminated wood, animal sinew, and horn. This construction gave it a tremendous draw weight and power, allowing it to shoot arrows with enough force to pierce Roman shields and armor at a distance. These riders were the ultimate skirmishers, a fluid swarm that could attack from any direction and melt away before any heavy infantry could hope to close with them. They were famous for the Parthian shot, feigning a full-speed retreat, only to have the rider twist his entire body around in the saddle and fire a final, deadly volley at his pursuers. The second unit was the cataphract. If the horse archers were a scalpel, the cataphracts were a sledgehammer. These were heavy shock cavalry. The rider, a nobleman, was encased head to toe in scale or mail armor. Even his horse was armored. Their weapon was the contos, a massive, two-handed lance. They were not meant for skirmishing. They were a living battering ram, a 1,500-pound armored projectile designed to deliver a single, decisive, earth-shattering charge that could shatter any infantry line that was already weakened, disorganized, and demoralized by the endless harassment of the horse archers. Crassus knew of these troops in theory, but Roman arrogance led him to believe his legions could withstand any cavalry charge and that barbarian arrows were no match for Roman steel and discipline. His first, and perhaps most fatal mistake, was made before he even saw a single Parthian warrior. His ally, Artavasdes, the king of Armenia, came to his camp with 6,000 of his own excellent cavalry and sound, urgent advice. He begged Crassus to invade through the mountains of Armenia. The rugged terrain, he argued, would protect the legion's vulnerable flanks and completely nullify the advantage of the Parthian cavalry, forcing them into the kind of close quarters the Romans would inevitably win. Crassus refused. He was an old man in a hurry, and he was suspicious of Artavasdes' motives. The mountain route was slow and arduous. He chose the direct route, straight east across the open desert of Mesopotamia. It was the fastest way to the heart of the enemy's territory, the fastest way to the glory he so desperately craved. It was also the perfect killing ground for a cavalry army. He had chosen, out of impatience and arrogance, to fight the Parthians on their terms, in their element. The march was brutal. The sun was merciless. The landscape was a flat, endless expanse of sand and scrub that offered no cover and no reprieve. The Roman scouts, led by a charismatic allied Arab chieftain named Ariomnes, promised an enemy in disarray, a Parthian kingdom ripe for the picking. This was a calculated lie. Ariomnes was a Parthian agent, a plant sent by the enemy, and he was deliberately leading the Roman army into a perfectly prepared trap. Finally, in May of 53 BC, near the provincial town of Carrhae, the scouts returned in a panic. The enemy was near. Crassus's quaestor, a capable and clear-headed officer named Gaius Cassius Longinus, the very same Cassius who would later be a ringleader in the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar, advised the general to deploy the army in a long, traditional battle line, with cavalry protecting the wings to prevent being outflanked by the mobile Parthian force. Crassus, now visibly worried and indecisive, overruled him. Fearing his line would be too thin and could be easily broken, he ordered the army to form a massive hollow square. Each side was made up of 12 cohorts, a solid wall of men, with the vulnerable baggage train and cavalry protected in the center. This formation was strong defensively, a veritable fortress of shields and spears, but it was incredibly slow and cumbersome. It sacrificed all mobility and offensive capability for perceived safety. It was the formation of an army that was already afraid. As the legions finished lumbering into their square, the enemy appeared on the horizon.
It was not the grand Parthian host Crassus had expected. It was a force of just 10,000 men, commanded by a brilliant young general named Surena. 9,000 of them were horse archers. A mere 1,000 were cataphracts. The Parthians advanced not with trumpets or horns, but with the thunderous, unnerving alien sound of dozens of large kettle drums, a deep, rhythmic booming that seemed to shake the very air. At first, they concealed their cataphracts, advancing with their armor covered in black cloths and leather, creating a drab, unimpressive sight. Then, as they drew near, a signal was given. They threw off the coverings. Plutarch, the historian, wrote that the cataphracts suddenly gleamed, their polished steel helmets and Margian steel armor flashing like fire, a terrifying transformation from a dull mass into 1,000 points of blinding light. The psychological assault was followed by the physical one. The 9,000 horse archers fanned out, a fluid living crescent that completely surrounded the Roman square from a safe distance, and then they began to shoot. For the legionaries, it was a waking nightmare. There was no enemy to charge, no battle line to engage. There was only the endless whistling rain of arrows from a constantly moving swarm of enemies they could not reach. The arrows were so powerful, they punched through shields, nailed hands to the wood, and pinned soldiers' feet to the dusty ground. The Romans formed the famous tertudo, or tortoise formation, interlocking their shields over their heads to create an armored shell, but even this offered little protection from the high arcing shots, and the formation only made the legions a larger, more stationary target. Crassus hoped, he prayed, that they would eventually run out of arrows. This was another fatal miscalculation. Surena, the Parthian general, had brought with him a baggage train of 1,000 camels loaded with nothing but tens of thousands of spare arrows. As one group of archers expended their quivers, they would simply ride back to the camel train, resupply, and return to the line without a pause. The arrow storm was to be perpetual. The Parthian system was working just as perfectly as the Roman system was supposed to. The Roman square was being slowly bled to death, the men baking inside their armor, unable to fight back, able to do nothing but stand and die. Seeing the situation was hopeless, seeing his plan had utterly failed, Crassus gave the only order he could. He commanded his son, Publius Crassus, a brave and decorated officer who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul, to take the cavalry, archers, and some infantry and charge, to drive the archers away at any cost. Publius charged with desperate courage. The Parthian horse archers immediately wheeled and fled, just as they were trained to do. Believing he had them on the run, his blood up, Publius and his men pursued them eagerly, galloping for miles across the plain, becoming dangerously, fatally separated from the main Roman square. It was a classic feigned retreat, a trap. Once Publius was completely isolated, the horse archers suddenly turned, swarming around his force from all sides. At the same time, the 1,000 cataphracts who had been waiting patiently finally moved. They lowered their massive lances and charged. The Gallic cavalry under Publius were brave, but they were no match for the heavy armor of the cataphracts and their horses. Their lances, by contrast, could often impale 2 men at once. The Roman force was surrounded and systematically butchered. Publius, wounded by an arrow and seeing no hope of escape, ordered his shield-bearer to kill him to avoid the shame of capture. Back at the main square, Crassus had felt a moment of profound relief as the arrow storm lessened. He thought his son had succeeded. Then a new sound was heard from the Parthian lines, a great, triumphant roar of victory. A single Parthian rider galloped towards the Roman lines. He was carrying a long spear. Impaled on the tip of it, for all the Romans to see, was the severed head of Publius Crassus. Plutarch says that the sight, while horrifying to the legionaries, did not shatter their courage, but it utterly destroyed the morale and nerve of their commander. The arrow storm resumed with even greater fury and continued relentlessly until nightfall finally brought a temporary reprieve. That night was one of abject misery and despair. The Romans did not bury their dead or tend to their comrades. The cries and pleas of the thousands of wounded men left lying on the battlefield echoed through the darkness. Crassus himself had a complete mental breakdown, pulling his cloak over his head and lying on the ground, a broken man, unwilling to speak to anyone. Command fell to his two senior officers, Cassius and Octavius. They organized a desperate night retreat, making the brutal decision to abandon their thousands of wounded and what was left of their baggage train. The retreat was a week-long horror story. The Parthians, guided by local Arabs who knew the terrain, harried them every step of the way, hunting them down like animals. Finally, Surenna offered Crassus a truce to discuss terms of surrender. Crassus's own men, starving, thirsty, and on the verge of mutiny, forced him to go. He knew it was a trap, telling his officers as he left, "You are witnesses to the shame and violence of this necessity, but all the world will know that the Parthians have deceived us." During the negotiations, a scuffle was deliberately started. Crassus and all his senior officers were cut down and killed. The Roman army ceased to exist. Historians estimate that of the more than 40,000 men who marched into Mesopotamia, 20,000 were killed and another 10,000 were captured and marched off to the far east Parthian frontier to serve as slaves and border guards. Only a few thousand, led by the resourceful Cassius, managed to fight their way back to Syria. Most devastatingly for Roman honor, the Parthians captured the legionary eagles, the sacred golden standards of the legions. To lose an eagle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on Rome's honor that would not be cleansed for 30 years when the Emperor Augustus finally recovered them through diplomacy, not force. A gruesome story later emerged, recorded by the historian Cassius Dio. The Parthians, in a final
symbolic act of mockery against the famously greedy Roman, supposedly poured molten gold down the throat of Crassus's severed head, saying, "You thirsted for gold, now drink your fill." While likely a dramatic invention, the legend captures the essence of how Rome's enemies, and indeed many Romans, viewed the disastrous campaign. A war born not of strategy, but of pure, arrogant greed. The victor, the brilliant general Surenna, did not get to enjoy his triumph for long. His king, Orodes II, jealous and fearful of his general's stunning success, had him executed shortly after. The consequences for Rome were profound. The death of Crassus shattered the first triumvirate, removing the crucial buffer between the two remaining giants, Caesar and Pompey. Their rivalry, no longer checked by a third partner, spiraled out of control. 4 years later, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, plunging the Republic into a catastrophic civil war that would ultimately destroy it. The Battle of Carrhae stands as one of the most decisive and humiliating defeats in Roman history. It was a lesson written in blood and shame. The perfect war machine had been proven to be imperfect. It showed that courage and discipline meant little without the right strategy, and that Roman arrogance could not conquer a desert that refused to play by Roman rules. Crassus had chased glory into the east and found only death, disgrace, and a disaster that would echo for centuries.